start the recording. There we go. Oh, it announces
Oh,
recordings now. Right, I was going to put everyone on mute as we get started. We get a couple more people joining us, but really lovely to have such a nice group with us, and hopefully I know there's some people who are going to be joining us online as well. Um, what I wanted to talk with you all about this evening is what's recently become a favorite topic, I guess, for me, because I also was talking about this in Shavuot, which is exorcism in Judaism. And in particular, what I would look at today is the phenomenon of a tremendous growth in exorcism stories in a particular time in a particular place. So I want to briefly introduce that time and place. I want to kind of give some vague outlines as to what we're talking about, and then I want to look at a few stories in depth because that's really the best way to get a sense of it. So the time and place is largely the city of Svat in northern Israel. Who's been to Svat? Anybody? Yeah, it's behind me. In case you haven't been, that's what it looks like. It's a very old city, one of the four holy cities of Judaism. It's lots of small alleyways. It's perched very high in the Galilean hills. It's been associated for a long time with mysticism in some variety or another, but in particular, it takes on the connotation of mysticism in the 1550s or so. Between kind of 1500 to 1600, Sfat transforms from a pretty small Ottoman backwater to being the absolute center of Jewish spirituality in the world. The reason is because a huge amount of emigres from Spain, who have kind of finally been forced out, either via Portugal or via Spain itself or via Amsterdam or wherever else, end up settling in Sfat in particular. And when they do so, they bring with them this really creative, innovative, powerful spirituality, which transforms into what we now know as Kabbalah. So almost all of what we understand to be Kabbalah today is traceable to Sfat, and in particular to one primary teacher in Sfat named Isaac Luria, often called Ha'ari in Hebrew, the lion, which is an acronym for his name, who only was teaching actually for about 20 months. He died in the plague only 20 months into teaching when he was 38, but in that time gave a complete new interpretation of the Zohar, which had been a couple hundred years earlier, and of Kabbalah more broadly, and as a result, kind of completely transformed the Jewish world. It's hard to overestimate the role that a small group of people in real dedication to a particular cause played in shaping the history of Judaism. Several things are really significant about the Kabbalah that Isaac Luria, the Ari, taught. One of them is the role of the feminine. Now, it wasn't new for Isaac Luria to introduce this idea. It comes from the Zohar and from earlier texts. But the idea that the Zohar introduces, which Luria really expanded, was that God is experienced predominantly as a feminine entity by worshippers. There is both a feminine aspect to God and a masculine aspect of God, but we can only really access the feminine aspect. And as a result, the relationship between the mystic or the worshipper or the individual, who obviously, because of patriarchy, is male, and God is a predominantly romantic, erotic one. And the whole tenor of religious life changes to be something which is deeply charged with eroticism. This is what creates Kabbalat Shabbat, the ritual of Friday night, in which we sing a bunch of love songs to God, all addressed in the feminine, and then welcome that feminine presence of God as a bride, the wedding which we are celebrating. This is what's created lots of other practices, including some that we don't even realize. I don't want to spoil what's known as shuckling for anyone, which is the rocking back and forth while praying the Amidah, but it also emerges from this time and also is surely evocative of a certain thrusting position, which may have referenced the understanding of what prayer is from the point of view of these mystics. Lots of stuff was explicitly sexual, and it shaped and reshaped the way in which not only people understood God, but also how they understood each other as people. At the same time that there's a reappraisal of God's femininity, there's a huge reappraisal of the role that women play in society. Women are further isolated by this because they're further seen as more and more holy, which means they're both removed further from public life, but also honored further in that private space. So there's kind of a dual maneuver that happens. Mystics are encouraged to see their wives as an embodiment of God, the female God, Shekhinah, and as a result, there's a focus on sexual pleasure, on being a good husband, on all these sort of things, which there wasn't before, which changes a lot of dynamics in Jewish life. And there's also more of a role, in some way, for women to participate in the mystical life of the community, which wasn't the case before. And that's where we see these stories of exorcism. So Gershom Scholem, the historian of Kabbalah, is famous for saying that Judaism has no female mystics. And this is in contradistinction to how he looks at Christian mysticism. If anyone's ever looked at Julian of Norwich or Teresa of Avila or all of these medieval female Christian mystics, there's once again a hugely erotic, sexualized, deeply spiritual, mystical experience, which is written about from a woman's perspective. This is largely absent in Jewish sources, while it's present in both Christian mystical sources in the monastic tradition and in some Islamic sources as well. In early Sufi texts, there were several female mystics who were notable. But Scholem felt like this was absent from Jewish mysticism. But he wasn't entirely correct, because actually, one thing that we see is that during this period in the 1560s, 1570s, especially in Svat, but throughout the Jewish world, women were taking on roles and leadership roles in some way in spiritual life, but they were doing it in unorthodox, we might think, ways. And one of those ways was through kind of spiritual knowledge, clairvoyance, and possession by spirits. We're going to look at two stories in depth, neither of which is really about the key women, because actually the stories about the key women are not written down. But we have from secondary sources and from multiple sources notes and comments and descriptions of several women in these communities who were seen as wise women and authorities who could predict the future, who could tell people what would happen to them in the short term and the long term, who could give curses and blessings, who could write spells, all of these sort of rituals. Some of them had Spanish names. One of the most famous in Svat was a woman called Soñadora, who evidently could interpret dreams. Some of them had Ashkenazi names who had moved to Svat to be as part of this community. One of them being a famous woman named Rachel Aberlin, who had come from Germany to live in Svat and evidently was both a funder of these mystics and their spiritual pursuits, and also a mystic herself and included in the pursuits. There was a young woman who we only know by her name Francesca, who evidently was a seer who could see the future and who would attend Isaac Luria's lessons in the Beit Midrash, something uncommon for a woman to do at the time. And she would often predict people's fates and their deaths and what might happen to them, and she was always right, the sources that we have tell us. So we have all these glimpses of ways in which women were starting to claim some kind of spiritual authority at the time. It's hard to imagine that it's not related very deeply to the fact that at the same time, Jews were re-envisioning how they see God. If you start to see God as a feminine persona, then the women around you start to take on a more divine persona. It's inevitable that that's the case. And it's obviously a very fluid and creative and flexible time. Lots of things happened in this time and place that we didn't see happen elsewhere. Lots of elements of Jewish life were present there that kind of died out after and weren't present before. So there's something quite remarkable about this particular community in this particular time that shaped a lot of Jewish history, and in particular shaped a lot of how we understand gender and spirituality and mysticism in Jewish history. So what I want to look at is a couple texts from some of the students around Isaac Luria, two stories in particular, and we're going to go through and read them together as we always do, both of which describe women being possessed. Now, I slightly misbilled our learning this evening because I called it Women, Demons, and Power, but there's actually no demons involved. Sorry if anyone, I know, sorry to disappoint, but demons in the Jewish tradition exist, but they're actually a totally separate thing from spirit possession, which has a different root altogether. So the demonic texts, those about Lilith and those about different demons who consume babies and terrorize people and usually hang out in bathrooms. Demons in bathrooms evidently are a thing. You see that in the Talmud, lurking in public toilets. Those texts are different in a lot of ways. They're about a different thing, which is some kind of trickstery being who evidently likes hanging out in toilets and ruins and things. Those texts have nothing to do really with what we understand as the spirit possession texts, which are about people, predominantly women, being possessed by the spirits of those who have died. There's actually a huge genre of these, huge amount of literature in these, a lot of which has been lost or has never been published or remains in manuscript. On Shavuot, we looked at this one story from a collection of stories, uncharacteristically collection, from the premier exorcist of the 20th century, a guy named Hacham Yehuda Fataya, who was an exorcist in Baghdad and then Jerusalem. So it's very much a modern thing as much as it is an early modern thing. But there's no doubt that exorcism has a rich tradition. It's just always by spirits of those who have died, never by demons, how we conventionally understand demons, at least. So although it might feel like we're talking about the Exorcist movie with the little girl and whatever else, that notion of a demon is slightly different than our notion here of a spirit of someone who's died. And we'll see that in both the stories in terms of what the exorcists are looking for. So what we have is male exorcists who are mostly interrogating female possessed, who are possessed by male spirits, usually. And the dynamics and the gender play that's created by that is quite interesting. And there's a lot of elements in which this creates a different balance of power as well. Many of the women, some of whom we're going to meet when we look at these sources, who were possessed in notable famous cases, which are written about in multiple sources, went on afterwards to be the kind of wise women in the 1590s and 1600s who were consulted in these mystical circles. So post possession, there's something that changes where these women could claim more power than other women were able to do. And that's what's quite interesting is what is it about the experience of exorcism which allows women to enter spiritual leadership in a way that they couldn't otherwise. And that's what we're going to take a look at. Yeah. Any questions about my convoluted introduction to this before we pull up some sources? Is anyone like, wait, we have exorcism? If you're
I've
speaking, I
learned
can't
not
hear
to
you.
be
Yeah.
surprised that we have stuff that actually we think we don't have, because we seem to have everything that we think we don't have. So
yeah, I think it's not something we usually learn about at Cheder, maybe to our detriment.
no.
But we everything that's present in any religious tradition is probably present in Judaism. Doesn't mean it's normative, by the way. There's a lot of fringe things, but there's always something. There's something for everyone. There's werewolves and vampires and possession and all of the supernatural things that go bump in the night. We just don't like talking about it because we want to seem modern and enlightened. But I don't think the two actually necessarily contradict each other, which maybe you'll disagree. Yeah, Anne, you have a question before we dive in?
I've got lots of questions, but one in particular, because I've been jotting as per usual. So if we have wise women who can see the future and etc., I'm not saying herbalists, but soothsayers, future seers, are these not the things that are banned in the Bible?
It was really, really good. And it applies actually to the male exorcists as well, because as we'll see, a lot of what they want to do is interrogate the spirits to find out what happens after you die. All of which would seem to be the things prohibited by the Tanakh. You know, Baal Ovi Doni, we read many times, people who consult oracles and spirits. We read the story of the witch of Endor, of course, where we have Shmuel and Shaul and the ghost and all of these depictions which tell us that these things are real, but we're not meant to use them. That's what the Tanakh suggests. So these rabbis justify themselves, and they're aware of this, of course, as well. They're very learned rabbis, by basically creating a distinction between what in scholarly terms is considered black magic versus white magic, language which itself is problematic. But permissive magic is what they believe they're using for a good purpose. In particular, they're healing people, right, when they're exorcising spirits. And the women are helping people by telling the future. But those who are critically minded can always kind of poke some holes at this distinction, because at some point you have to draw a line between what's acceptable magic and what isn't, and where you draw that line is not obvious, and people do it in different places. And many of these stories are cautionary tales. If you really want to read a wild story, look up the story of Joseph de la Reina, who is a rabbi who evidently tried to bring on the Messiah and ended up in a horrible situation. And it was a famous story that got told and retold to caution against what was called Kabbalah Ma'asit, practical Kabbalah, or magic. Because although there was permissive uses, the understanding was it was very unlikely you would succeed at those permissive uses without straying into the impermissive ones, unpermitted ones.
Is there the idea of permissible magic and magic that isn't permissible, and also what the definition of magic is? Is a bracha magic? Is it a magic spell in itself? When we are reciting the Amidah, is that a magic spell as well? Because we're asking for stuff and then saying
Yeah.
thank you. And so at what point is something magic rather than prayer?
Yeah, absolutely. And everyone draws that line somewhere different. And the truth is, it depends how you define magic. But if magic is you say words with a certain intention and you expect something to change in the world around you, then much of what we do, in as we call prayer, is probably magic. Also, much of what we do as Jews is informed by magical thinking, and we either cover that up or replace that explanation with others. For instance, the reason we blow the shofar on Rosh Hashanah is partially because it mentions this will be a day of shrieking in the Torah, but the rabbinic explanation is also because the shofar scares away demons. And on the day that we want to kind of have God hear our prayers so that we can get written in the right book, we don't want to keep the demons there. We want to make sure they back off. So we blow the shofar. The demons don't like it. It gives us a little bubble during which our prayers get through. And that's why we blow it 100 times. That's why we blow it in this pattern. That's why we do this. That's why we do that. There's many instances of that people don't talk about, but actually are at the base of much of what we do as Jews. So it's impossible to actually filter out everything that might be magic. It's just a matter of where you draw the line. Some people draw it in different places, and these guys who we're reading are drawing it at a very different place than most, but it's no different than what we do when we draw a line in our own practice between what's acceptable and what isn't. So, two stories for us this evening. I think we might only get a chance to read one in depth, but I've got two here because I couldn't choose. So there's lots of them, and just a big shout out here for a fabulous book on this topic, which is called Between Worlds. I don't know if you can see that on my screen, probably not, it's tiny, but it's by a guy whose name you can see here, Yossi Chayes, often in English written as J. Chayes, with a J in it, as it is here, who's a scholar in Israel and particularly likes studying these stories, and it's very helpfully translated lots of them into English, and these are adapted from his translations in a series of articles. So the first one is about Ferrara. Ferrara is a city in Italy where there was a large Jewish community which was closely connected with the Kabbalists in Svat, and where there was lots of travel back and forth. This is narrated by a rabbi named Gedalia ibn Yahya, who was one of the people in the Ari's kind of school back in Svat. This was published in 1586, but as we can see in the very beginning, the story takes place in 1574, which is just after the Ari dies, and as these things are starting to spread beyond Svat. The Ari dies in 1572. He was 38. He was only teaching for 20 months. And after he dies, his Torah, his teaching really spread. And you can see that in this rabbi now traveling to Italy and telling us this story in Ferrara. So what I'd like to do is just kind of read through this and discuss as we go. Please take yourself off mute and shout out when you have something to say, because nobody wants to hear me talk the whole time. And someone like to volunteer to read for us, at least to start out. I can't see everyone at once, so just shout out if you do.
I'll read out.
Please.
Okay, the spirit in Ferrara. I experienced this in the month of Tevet 5335, December 1574, while I was in Ferrara. I went to visit a young woman of 25 years of age, a young wife, in the company of many distinguished people. I found her stretched out on her bed, lying on her back, like a body without soul. Her eyes were closed, her mouth was open, and her tongue was very thick from the lip inward. The men and women supporting her said that the spirit was situated in her tongue. Then I said to myself, this is the day I have hoped for, to know new revelations regarding the departure of the soul from the body.
Okay, so I'll pause you there for a minute, Andrew. So we have the setup. Our narrator, Gedalia, has gone to Ferrara, a pretty big trip from Svat, in order to help in this case. That presumes he's a specialized exorcist who is called upon in a special case. And he finds a young woman, 25 years of age, recently married, who is being looked after by many people. And what is his primary interest?
Spirit in her tongue.
Okay, so he locates immediately where the spirit is by physical description, right? He's doing a check. He sees that her tongue is swollen from the lip inwards. Hard to know exactly what that means, but I think the entirety of her mouth is swollen and her tongue swollen within it, which is obviously very concerning. And he's excited about this. Why, Jackie?
It's just more interested. It's a bit like a surgeon who is operating on someone who's dying and is really, really interested in the intricacies of, I don't know, how the little fingernail is attached to the rest of the finger, you know, rather than the actual person themselves.
Right. So it's interesting analogy to make, but clearly I get the sense that what you're saying is this isn't about, he's not excited to help this woman. He's excited to gain information from her. She is a useful tool because she has information. Now that's the key thing to start with. Information is power, right? He has the opportunity through her, whether it is her, whether it's a spirit.
Does she have the information, or does the spirit have the information?
There's a deep ambiguity there about who knows what, right? In these stories, we have three actors: the exorcist, the person possessed, and the spirit possessing them. They're also often all talking interchangeably, and it's hard for us to imagine the scene of what exactly is happening, who's speaking. Sometimes it's clear, sometimes it's not. Yeah, Anne, I can see your hand.
I'm sorry, it sounds like anaphylactic shock.
It does, right? If we were to
That's what happens to me if I go into shock.
Yeah, swollen tongue. Absolutely, absolutely. Now, keep in mind, many of these rabbis were doctors. Many of them were trained as physicians. So they do tend to understand the difference between medical complaints as they understood them and spiritual ones. And we'll see them use some medical language as well. So chances are that, we can assume that he thought this was a sign of purely spiritual affliction, and had the sense to check first whether it wasn't. Let's hope. Okay, Andrew, do you want to read a bit more?
Okay. After I begged the spirit and strongly implored him to respond to my questions, he responded in Italian with clearly enunciated letters, well heard, that his name was Battista de Modena, who had been hung as a punishment for theft. He began to make a crying voice and groans, and I comforted him with good words, and he was comforted. I began to ask him questions regarding the soul in order to know its essence and the manner of its departure from the body at the time of death, its paths thereafter, and what was Gehenom. I did not ask about Gan Eden, for I knew that it was inaccessible to him, nor other questions like that. To them all, he answered common words, and the seal of his words was, I don't know, saying that he was a man of the field and a shepherd of beasts. And in the course of his words, I came to regard him as a beast.
Right. So we meet our spirit, Battista de Modena, not your average Jewish bloke by any means. The woman who he has possessed is a Jewish woman. That's why Rabbi Gedalia has been called. But the spirit within her is a Catholic man, okay, who was punished by hanging for theft, presumably in the local area, who Gedalia is able to comfort and then interrogate. But frustratingly, he doesn't get very many good answers, right? Everything the spirit says is, I don't know.
How do we know he's Catholic? Because it said he responded in Italian. Is that why?
Yeah, because it's Italy and it's 1574. So chances of him not being Catholic are very small. And his name, Battista de Modena, indicates Catholic Christian naming practice. We'll also see later on exactly the problem that's created by this interreligious possession. So it tells us something here that's quite important, which is that, souls of one gender can possess bodies of another. Souls of one religion can possess bodies of another. And here we have both, a Catholic man possessing a Jewish woman's body. The exorcist, Gedalia, he asks him about hell, right? What he calls Gehenom is basically what we often think of as hell, more or less. But he doesn't bother to ask him about Gan Eden, right, which is heaven in his conception, because he knows he won't know anything about it. Which is very interesting. He doesn't ask questions he knows he won't have the answer to. But even the questions he does ask, the spirit doesn't have the answer to, right? The seal of all of his words was, I don't know. You can just hear the frustration in his writing this, right? Because the guy was a shepherd of beasts, and then he includes an insult. I came to regard him as a beast as well. So clearly he's disappointed in the quality of the spirit that he's come to Ferrara to exercise. Okay. Let's read on a bit more. Someone else want to pick up for us?
Yeah, I can do.
Yeah, Jason, thank you.
He had the power to rule and force the young woman according to his will, like not eating meat on Friday and saying their prayers upon the early evening ringing of the bell on Saturday, and things according to the customs of the Christians. I asked him what it mattered to him if that girl's body ate meat on Friday. He responded that it was a sin for him because he also derived pleasure from her eating. I asked him what was the essence of his body, and he responded, I don't know. I asked him his size, whether it was like the egg of a goose, a chicken, or a dove, and he responded, of a chicken. I asked him where he was situated in the body of the woman, and he responded, between her ribs and loins on the right side. I asked him, who put them there? And he responded, I do not know. I asked him to depart from there, and he responded, I cannot.
Okay, thank you. What's your impression of these little tidbits we're getting about Batista here?
Maybe he's quite a frum Christian.
Yeah, right. Right. He's a very frum Christian. The question that the Exorcist asks is so funny, right? He says, "What do you care whether she eats meat on Friday? It's her body, not yours. You're just in it." But he's getting benefit by virtue of being in her body, and so lechumra, right, as a stringency, he doesn't let her eat meat on Fridays because the Catholic soul that's living in between her ribs and her loins on her right side, might end up getting some benefit when she eats, and thus would be violating his own religion.
I think it's really quite interesting because the familiarity for me is some of the work that's done in, certainly the work that I do in sort of psychotherapy is this working with parts of people, and you do working with parts, and this is a part of somebody. We're not talking about when people have this idea of multiple personalities or anything like that. It's just different parts of people who have different roles, and sometimes they need to be there because they help protect somebody. And we talk about them, where do you feel them in your body? Where do you feel this in your body? And if it could have a shape, what shape would it be? What would it look like? And have a chat with it and find out why it's there and what purpose it's serving. And one part of the body has a chat with the other part of the body. And this is all very familiar. Very familiar.
How about the size piece, Jackie? His question of, is it like the egg of a goose, a chicken, or a dove?
Absolutely. You would ask. I mean, it can be done also not only with parts of self, but also with pain, with actual physical pain. You ask people, if this pain had a shape, what shape would it be? What size would it be? What color would it be? Would it be opaque or transparent? Would it be warm or hot? How would it feel to touch it? And you work with that,
right.
As you would do with, and as you would do with a different aspect of the personality.
Right. Right, it's interesting. So we have quite a large area that's being defined, right, between the bottom of her ribs, we can assume, and her genitalia on her right side, somewhere around her right hip, roughly.
Yeah.
But the location, as you're saying, of the spirit is about the size of a chicken's egg, which, as we know, isn't very large, right? That's the medium size. He gives them 3 potential sizes: large, medium, and small. Goose, chicken, and dove. Chicken's egg is pretty small. You can imagine that lump, right? That feeling of it being something discrete in her body. That is what this spirit represents.
Yeah.
And I interpret it in a much more sort of concrete way, which it sounds a bit like a tapeworm.
Okay, right? A real parasitic thing.
Yes, in your body, and it's controlling your appetite, and it's a physical thing that seems to suck the energy out of you.
Yeah, it's interesting, the material. You can read it very materially and look at it as a substance, or read it even more metaphorically and look at it as a representation of emotion of trauma. Either way, it's hard for us to directly assimilate either of these two options, which are really fascinating because he's talking to it. And tapeworm or trauma, we don't talk to it in this way, although maybe metaphorically. But it is responding to Gedalia in Italian, in nice Italian, he tells us, explaining about its location. Although most of what it's saying is, I don't know, I can't tell you, I can't do that. Lots of negative answers to all the questions he's raised. Right. Jason, do you want to read on a bit more? You were doing great.
Yeah, thanks. I asked him why he entered the body of a Jewish woman. He responded that it pained him that she was not aware of his entrance there, and that he had been able to avoid it. He would not have entered there. I asked him from what place he entered. He responded through her genitals. He also informed me how it was, as we later heard from the young woman. I asked him with great pleading that he leave the girl quiet until I could speak to her, and he was pacified. In his movement to his place, we saw the throat of the woman swell greatly. The woman felt great pain in all her limbs and shook and quaked with difficulty and wondrous strangeness, prompting great compassion among all observers. When the spirit entered his place, the girl's entire body, and that side in particular, would shake and quake continuously, like the consumption before the fever in tuberculosis. Immediately, she opened her eyes and saw us.
Okay.
Wow.
Yeah, so what's the wow?
It's just reminiscent of The Exorcist or something like that, where the body is kind of, shaking or writhing in weird movements and then suddenly sitting bolt upright with the eyes wide open or something.
Yeah, it's quite eerie. Absolutely, right. The question is,
stuff.
yeah, if we didn't have those horror movie reference points, would this be scary? The description?
Oh, yeah. I reckon.
Probably either way. Yeah. What else do we make? What do we make of the imagery? Obviously, there's a very Freudian conversation to be had here. We don't have Gail Leafy with us today. It's a shame about the kind of penetrative imagery of the spirit entering through genitalia, especially a male spirit entering through genitalia, and also his regret. He feels kind of complicated feelings about this, that she wasn't aware, that he would have rather not entered a Jewish woman. Is that because of his own distaste for the fact that she's a Jewish woman, or out of respect for her Jewishness? It's not clear.
Could have just been the fact he didn't want to be within a woman, because women were, even he as a lowly cattle or shepherd, keeper of beasts, was above a woman.
Very much could be, absolutely. We don't really get a sense of how. We'll see more of her description of what happened, but we don't get a sense of why this woman and not someone else. And in other stories, there's usually kind of it's not quite accidental, but there's a circumstance. Someone is in the wrong place at the wrong time. Spirits kind of slip in and out, or they hiding. There's a lot of series that we see in the second story, if we get a chance to look at it, about spirits hiding from the angels who are there to punish them, and they end up kind of accidentally taking refuge in someone's body and getting stuck and not being able to leave. This notion that kind of spirits of the dead are constantly around us and kind of in surfaces and in people and able to kind of end up at the wrong place is something that's probably very foreign to us, right? However we imagine the process of death and dying, we don't usually live in a world which is very animated by spirits. We have largely kind of abandoned that with the advent of modernity and the Enlightenment. But for most of our ancestors, and actually many cultures still today, the world is fully animated by spirits, objects, houses, places, elements, right? Spirits of the dead or of animals or of nature itself kind of are constantly engaging with the material reality we experience. And we can see a little bit of that in our own tradition here, just the normalness of this to some degree in terms of him understanding, oh yes, he doesn't ever question, oh, there's a spirit in her body, it's located here, it moves from her throat to the place that it's normally living. That's all taken for granted. Yeah, Robin.
given that it's all taken for granted, it just feels, why is it so rare? Do we get any insight about why he has to travel? He's so excited and has to travel to Italy to, because there are a hell of a lot of spirits around. So where are they all? If then, and why is it such a rare? Do we get any insight into that?
So they do themselves, these stories give some explanations that, it's only spirits who are particularly afflicted by some kind of wrongful death, who are stuck, right? The kind of unfinished business idea. But still, with the billions of people on the planet, you would think it would be a much more frequent thing. What's astounding, and which the tradition itself can't explain, but which anthropologically we see, is that exorcism seems to happen when people believe in it. Right, at the times and places where people are expecting exorcism to happen because it's part of their framework, spirit possession to happen, it happens. Right, and this is true even today. If you live in a culture in which you expect spirit possession to be a thing, in which you believe that the spirits of the dead can possess people, then there's lots of cases of spirit possession that happen. The more people believe in it, the more it happens. Whether that's confirmation bias, or whether that's some kind of magical thinking, or whether that's just that it happens all the time, but many people ignore it or explain it as something else or don't talk about it, all of those could be explanations, right? Depending on who you ask, they'll give different explanations. I do think it's a combination that many people have supernatural experiences, however you frame that, spirit experiences they cannot explain, or have had at some point in their life an experience they cannot explain, but do not talk about it with other people for fear of being seen to be crazy. And the truth is, if you lived in a society where that wasn't seen as crazy, but was seen as a treatable medical problem in which you call a specialist and they fix it, you wouldn't have any problem talking about it. So part of it is just the kind of, once there's a framework for it, then there's also an acceptance of it. But part of it also, I think, is the kind of, not quite mass hysteria, but the way in which these cases reinforce each other. And which is what we see, that at a particular time and place, there's usually a kind of upswelling of these cases, and then they kind of disappear for a while. Okay.
I just ask, so she must have been possessed for a long time for a message to get from her to Svat and then for the rabbi to come back.
Yeah, so unfortunately, we don't get a huge amount of detail in this one. Sometimes they tell us how long. Sometimes there's multiple stages in Exorcists. This one, we don't get that detail, but I think you're right. We can assume at least a couple months that she's been experiencing this as a fairly young, newly married woman. And here we see the end about exactly how it happened, and they still don't give us much detail. But let's read the last bit here. Someone else want to read this for us?
I'll read again if no one else wants to.
Sure. Go on.
Okay. I asked her what had happened, and she responded that after returning from immersing herself in the mikveh, she descended out of her house to the courtyard at 2 o'clock in the morning with a lit candle in her hand to draw water from the well in order to prepare food for her husband. She placed the lit candle in a hole near the well. Her husband, who had been with her, went away, and she took the pail to draw the water. Suddenly the candle extinguished, and she was taken by the spirit and lowered to the midst of the well. She was then lifted from there into the air. She did not know what he was, nor why, nor how. She screamed and fainted. The members of her household carried her to her bed and sought a remedy for her wound. Suddenly, the spirit reascended before our eyes, causing great pain and suffering to that girl. He did not allow her to speak further. This was what happened, and other events of this kind, and even more shocking, were told to me, and I have also seen them signed, one of them from the sages of Svat, that happened there. Another was from the sages of Italy, regarding a case in Ancona involving the spirits of men executed by hanging that entered the people's bodies. By means of adjurations and fumigations of sulphur and such in their nostrils, the spirits would make known and reveal their true names and tell of their matters, of all their experiences, of the place of their dwelling, and of the sins for which they have been punished, to enter the bodies and wander. Others have testified that all their words are true, and that by means of adjurations they expelled them from the bodies, and that the place from which the spirit exists swells.
Right. Frustrating non-conclusion to our story. We don't know what happened to the woman or her spirit. Michelle?
It sounds to me like she might have been raped, and she created a construct which explained her injuries. And then the trauma then became sort of embodied within her.
It's absolutely possible, and not at all difficult to imagine based on the information we have, and the situation that she finds herself in. Her own description, which is what was paraphrased here, not directly quoted but paraphrased, about the incident in question, is quite hard to imagine. I mean, of course, right, the evening after returning from the mikveh is traditionally the time in which is considered the most sexually significant. It would have been expected that her and her husband would have used that time in order to have sex, which is why probably she's up at 2 o'clock in the morning, although it's also common for people to wake up in the mid hours of the night and prepare food as she's doing. Her husband's with her, they're up together, which is again kind of surprising. They're outside, there's a candle, there's a well, all sorts of symbolism, right? The candle and the well falling into the well. There's a really deeply interesting kind of commentary on this from an archetypal point of view around the symbolism, which a lot of it is about penetration and about her experience of kind of being lifted up and falling down and fainting and people finding her and exactly that. So, I don't think it's impossible for us to look at this and go, maybe this is kind of someone unable to deal with trauma, in which case it's manifesting in the way that we would recognize. I also don't want to say it's just that, though, because maybe there is more to it. But I am really irritated that he doesn't tell us the ending. Some of these stories, they tell us what happened. Some of them, they don't. In some cases, the people are able to remove the spirit. In some, the spirit is not removable and the people die. I want to look at the second story as partially a contrast. I think I'll just read through it very quickly, and then we can see a little bit more. So at the end here, when he's explaining, I have lots of evidence for this, he references, I've seen one of them from the sages of Svat. This is that story, told multiple places, the possessed woman of Svat, which is from a few years earlier, but was circulated around at the same time. So I'm just going to kind of read through this. I might skip over some bits just quickly so we can have some context for this story. This story is written by someone, but it's told in the name of Chaim Vital, who was the Ari, Isaac Luria's primary student, and who is a very experienced exorcist who writes a lot about his exorcisms. One day, when we were in the study hall of my teacher, Isaac Luria, they brought one woman before him to know whether she was ill, or whether some spirit had enclosed himself in her. They said to Luria that she had been free from sickness or pain, and that suddenly she was transformed to this state. Her whole body shook. My teacher checked her pulse and said that it was a spirit who enclosed himself in her. He sent her home and told me to go there in the evening to remove the spirit from her. He also told me to be particularly wary of that spirit because he is a great deceiver, and when asked his name, he lies up to 3 times. He also gave me kavanot to remove him, special prayers used in exorcisms. For it was Luria's custom to send me to carry out this kind of mission, the reason being that I am from the soul root of Cain, which is severity, and judgments are only sweetened at their source. For this reason, I have this power. And so Chaim Vital is telling us that his teacher told him that he was spiritually reincarnated from Cain, and as a result, he has the power to exorcise demons because he has kind of an evilness at the root of his heart, which is very fascinating psychology, which is itself a whole interesting class. But what we see is a relationship between the teacher and the student here, which is key to the story. Now, I only left at dusk on Thursday night. That's too late. Before I went into the house of that woman, the spirit said to those standing there, "See that sage? Rabbi Chaim Vital has come here to remove me from her. We will see what his power is and what he's able to do. I'm not afraid of him. What power has he to remove me from here?" When I entered and the spirit saw my face and I greeted them, the spirit paid me great respect. Half his body arose and he began to quake. I asked him who he was and he responded, "I am so-and-so." I said to him, "Lies you speak, that's not your name." And thus he lied 3 times, and on the 4th time he said his true name, as my teacher said he would. Then I drew close to his ear, and I said a few kavanot, and the spirit panicked and spoke abusively and wanted to depart until I thoroughly rebuked him, and he gave me a sign that he wanted to depart by way of the little toe of the foot. This was a lie, for I saw that he was standing entirely in the throat, and that he wanted to depart and extinguish the candles and to harm those standing there. I left things in this state and went to pray the evening prayer at the home of my teacher. So first encounter, we see that the spirit says what his name is, it's a lie. 4th time he gives a real name, but he also says he'll leave via the woman's little toe, which is of course the least harmful way to leave. Maybe there's a little bit of damage to her toe, but Chaim Vital, of course, who's narrating the story for us, tells us he was so clever he realized that wasn't true. The spirit actually intended to leave via her throat, which we understand will kill her or harm her, and will harm the people in the room because the breath coming out will do some damage to them, blow out the candles, put them all in danger. So we have a deceptive spirit in this case who's trying to trick him. Right, he's back at Luria's house after Mariv. After we prayed and the comrades left, I told my teacher the entire episode. He said, I'm surprised for you, for I told you to go in the evening and you went at night, which is a time when all the spirits and the klipot, those are the evil spirits, have dominion. It's no time to act upon them, for it's their time. In the meantime, it had become very late, and rain was falling. My teacher told me, go in peace, and he walked with me a little, which he never did any other time. He said to me, you need to protect yourself from that spirit very well, for he is extremely angry with you for wanting to remove him from his place. I want to reveal one thing to you, and do not allow it to make your soul grow haughty. See the power that is yours, and how many klipot flee and fear you. For even if all the klipot in the world came, they would be unable to harm you. If you shake the corners of your garment, all will be free from you, and unable to all will flee before you, and be unable to stand before you. After this, I went to my house by way of the Jewish market, for that is my path. It was then already 1 o'clock at night. When I wanted to go up to the market, a dog came before me at close range, black and huge as a mule. I was shocked before him and could not recall any kavanah, for upon seeing him I forgot everything. I walked with great fear. I was close to him in a narrow place, fenced in on both sides. It was night, dark, and raining. I could not turn back from fear of the Turkish sergeants, and also because the klipot are behinders and adhere to and harm the back more than the front. You can't turn your back on them. I passed across from the dog, and behold, he cried out in a great voice. I was startled, and I fell upon the ground, and my hand touched the dog's paw. When I arose, the corners of my garment were full of mud, and I shook them, without the intention of performing a kavanah. But behold, the dog fled immediately and did not stand before me any longer. I walked home. The hand that touched the dog's paw was withered. In the morning I walked to the house of my teacher, and he said to me, did I not tell you to shake the corners of your garment? I also accompanied you. I did not enter my house until I saw that you had already entered your house, and my heart was with you. Then my teacher held my hand, and it returned to its original state. Lots of good magic here. After this, my teacher gave me different kavanot, and I went and spoke into the ear of the woman within whom was the spirit. The spirit did not want to leave. I went to my teacher and told him this, and he said to me, the spirit did just as you decreed upon him. He did not depart. He also gave me different kavanot, and they are written in the place. I went to the woman, and the spirit started to quake, and I recited those kavanot to the ear of the woman. I then asked the spirit through which place he entered the house. He responded there was a small hole in the wall, and from there he entered, because he was unable to enter from the entrance, upon which there was a kosher mezuzah, nor by way of the windows, for they are not for the comings and goings of men, and do not require a mezuzah. I had also asked him in what way he entered the woman. He said that he had been in that same house for 3 days before he entered the woman, and was seeking some opportunity to enter her. Finally, on Thursday night, that woman wanted to arise early to busy herself with her labor. When she was striking the steel and stone to release the fire, the spirit was sitting upon the stone, and the woman would strike, but no sparks would emerge. After she troubled herself greatly and there was no fire, she threw the steel from her hand in anger, and then he entered her, for he found an opening to enter her. Afterward I asked him what he did during those 3 days that he was in the house, and in what place he dwelled. He responded that he was hiding in a beam from which the candles are hung. He entered the beam because the guards appointed over him, those are angels, came, and he entered there, and they did not find him. I said to him, give me a sign this is true. And he responded to me that the sign was that on such and such a day you all ate such and that on such and such day the woman said such and such to her husband, and he responded to her such and such. And they acknowledged that such had been the case. Afterwards I released him from the nidui that I had decreed upon him. Then I caused him to go out, and he went away by means of the covenant that my teacher had given me. Okay, so a very different story. One, I realize we read quickly, but one in which we see the exorcist engage with the spirit. The spirit tricks him. He goes back and forth to his teacher. He encounters in the middle of the night a black, shaggy dog in the marketplace, which is a personification of his kind of fear, which he can scare away by shaking the corners of his garments, which of course have seat, which he does by accident. He doesn't seem to have much confidence in his own ability to exercise the spirit, but ends up being perfectly able to do so at the end. And the spirit gives us this complicated, convoluted narrative around how it actually snuck into the house via a hole, because it can't come through the door because the door is a mezuzah, and obviously it doesn't go through windows because people don't go through windows. And then it lived in a beam at the rafters for 3 days, waiting for the right moment to sneak into the woman, which was the moment she got frustrated and probably said a curse or something, did something angrily, when she couldn't strike the flint in order to light the fire in the middle of the night. And that's because, of course, the spirit was sitting on top of the stone using the flint. In both of these cases, right, we have what appear to be women who are victims of possession, potentially victims of sexual assault, as you say, Michelle, which I don't think is a difficult jump at all. We have similar situations in which we have women who are in the middle of the night in some vulnerable way, who are attacked by a spirit and who are possessed by it. But we also see the way in which the power of their possession kind of brings all these leading people to them and draws a lot of attention to them. What we don't see in these stories, but we see in other stories, are many times when the woman or the spirit, or ambiguously one or the other, speaks Torah and teaches knowledge, as we see a little bit here, and actually gains a great deal of power in the community. In both cases, one of the things we did see is that lots of people gravitated to these houses. There were lots of people around. This wasn't just the exorcist exorcising a person in isolation. It attracted people. It was a way for women to gain attention to some degree and also spiritual authority, because a lot of these women came to be seen as authorities by virtue of the possession and by virtue of surviving it. A lot of the women who did survive, and most of them seem to have, then took on roles as clairvoyants, as seers, as mystical wise women in the community. And it seems like part of that is because their experience of being possessed by a male spirit gave them a kind of post-gender, non-gendered status, in which after that they were able to kind of claim more male roles in the society around them, which is fascinating in some ways because it plays with a lot of our assumptions around what these stories are about. Who's the victim, who's the perpetrator, who's in power, who's not. It's not necessarily straightforward. But in all the cases, it gives us a really interesting window into a very important moment in Jewish history when the factors and the people and the places that happened have affected even what we do today. And yet what we're reading about is something that's very unfamiliar to us. So curious, we have a few minutes. Any kind of thoughts or reflections on looking a little bit at these stories, particularly with an eye to how this affects our understanding of gender and politics in this time and in our own? Yeah, Anne.
I'm going to go backwards slightly. The dog. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, put that into context of the dog in how it was thought, dogs were thought of in both the Hebrew and Muslim world, where actually dogs were things that you avoided at all costs.
Absolutely. The personification of evil could not be more than a big black shaggy dog, right? The grim of many European folklore as well. But in the Middle East, the dog, the expression in Hebrew for speak of the devil and the devil appears is speak of the dog and the dog appears. Dogs are seen as wicked and evil and dirty and nasty and personify everything horrible in the Hebrew imagination. Sorry for those who have dogs. They're lovely. I love dogs. But at the time, dogs were seen as something that only existed on the fringes of society. They ate the dead bodies that were thrown outside the city walls. They howled in the night. They weren't seen positively. Cats, on the other hand, they love cats. Muslims, Jews, and ancient Egyptians all share a love for cats. Yeah, Rotem.
Just an interesting observation, but it obviously has nothing to do with it. When we were in India, we heard that dogs were kind of like a transportation for demons. So they were kind of like left alone. You don't touch them, but you also don't take them as pet. But it was just really interesting that there are some similarities in the.
Absolutely. I wonder, it'd be a really interesting thing to look into is whether that is a belief that comes from Hindu traditions or whether that's a result of the Muslim conquest of India and a kind of survival of Mughal India in these kind of superstitions around dogs. You can see it certainly in the Quran as well. There's lots of anti-dog statements and pro-cat statements. And you can see, I mean, it goes back to ancient Egypt in some way, right? Anubis is kind of the one god that no one wants to deal with because he's kind of associated with death and in the worst possible way. Exactly as we looked at in the whole 16th century Muslim world, for sure. Right? You can see the Muslimness of the society. Remember, he mentions, I didn't want to go this way because I didn't want to run into the Turkish sergeants.
Yeah.
Right? This is still the Ottoman Empire. And so he's stuck between a dog on one side and a Turkish officer on the other in the middle of the night in this kind of panic state. And it's interesting that he tells this in the midst of talking about this exorcism he did, because they don't seem immediately related. But from our point of view and looking at the psychology and the gender and the encounter with otherness that these stories convey, it makes a lot of sense. The dog bit. Any other last reflections before we log off this evening?
I had a quick question whilst we're not mute. I'm Ashley, by the way, Rotham's fiance.
Hi.
About the language, I'm guessing it was written in Hebrew, right?
Yep.
And so in translation and things like that, like Hebrew has very different gender than English. And you talked about how like the gender was changing and if that was reflected maybe in the original writing.
It's interesting thing to point out because so much of the language for Hebrew around souls, around spirits, is usually feminine language, right? All three words used for the soul, nefesh, ruach, and neshama, are feminine words. And so usually, the default view of the soul, of the spirit of someone who's died is a feminine. So here, when it's specified in these stories that it's a male spirit inhabiting a female body, it's made really clear because of that, actually. They make a point to tell us. They tell us the names, they tell us whatever. There's some ambiguity sometimes, but it's the most frequent story I've encountered is male spirits inhabiting female bodies, which is quite telling in some way.
It strikes me, it reminds me of the idea of hysteria, which was something that women were said to suffer with. And the word, of course, meaning the idea of the wandering womb.
Yeah.
The womb came to different parts of the body and the woman lost her marbles because of that. So the idea of something sort of physically in the wrong place in the body that causes you to be detached from your reality.
Yeah.
Michelle, does that not remind you in some ways of young women who suffer from endometriosis?
Literal detachment in some ways of
who actually quite often will get psychological symptoms as well.
And to be honest, also the people who suffer from ME, which people can spend years in bed, perfectly rational people, but all of a sudden, because we know that long COVID had a trigger, ME and long COVID are quite analogous, and these are often sort of conditions that women suffer from disproportionately.
Absolutely. The link to hysteria in the 19th century to psychology's, psychology largely as a discipline is created to respond to this understanding of hysteria. That's hence the obsession with gender and sexuality to some extent. It also created the idea of hysteria. It's an interesting, map to look at 19th century well-educated doctors who believed that all these hysteric women, needed orgasms because of their wandering uteruses in their bodies. To a couple hundred years later, all these well-educated sages understanding that the problem was about spirit possession. It's not actually that different in some ways. In both cases, it happened at a time and in a society where women were starting to claim power for themselves, and that was very threatening to some degree. And so the inscribing of women's spiritual life within this idea of either hysteria, possession, whatever, is in some ways feels like a very reactionary move, but it's also a very liberatory move. It reflects that moment in society where you have kind of a change, and the change that was created by Jews thinking about God in female terms kind of echoes down through the divine to the human and has all sorts of effects on how men and women interact with each other, and obviously male and female spirits do as well. So
it's
sorry.
quite interesting if you just look at one other historical thing, because a lot of the Jews in Svat, and certainly the Jews in Italy at the time, were actually fleeing from an Inquisition run partially by a Catholic queen.
True. Absolutely. There's a really interesting, there's a lot of interesting stuff about Mary, Catholic Christianity, about Isabella, and how Isabella kind of represents to the Jews the anti-Shekhinah, right? This kind of powerful female, but that's enacting evilness. There's lots of interesting stuff going on at this time, and the big thing to take away, I think, is not only that it's fascinating, which it is, but also that it affects us. Because a lot of what we do as Jews today in 2021 in St. Albans is directly linked to these people, these named people we talked about today, their experiences and how they articulated Jewish life. Right? The author of the Code of Jewish Law, the Shulchan Aruch, a guy named Yosef Karo, was one of these people. Right? He spent his nights getting possessed by an angelic being who was feminine, who represented the Mishnah, and who talked to him about his sexual practices. And then by day, he wrote the Code of Jewish Law that we follow. So we cannot separate our Jewish life from this supernatural, mystical, very gender politic focused spiritual life of 1570s in Svat. And that means it really does matter. It's not just a fringe, crazy thing, although it's also that. It's actually quite essential to understanding Judaism after it, because it becomes a changing point for Jewish life since. So hopefully you've enjoyed a little window into this. Really do, if you're interested in this sort of thing, this book is really quite good and readable, and it disappeared into Svat. It's very supernatural fashion. It's also probably backwards, but it's called Between Worlds by Yossi Chayes. And he writes about Dybbuk's Exorcists and early modern Judaism. So he writes about these stories and others, and it's really quite an interesting topic. Thank you for joining me, and I hope that if you do get possessed,
Thank you.
you know who to call.